So to shed more light on how specialists such as yourselves can leverage artificial intelligence in the context of transforming this aspect of healthcare and patient care altogether, next, please join me in welcoming on stage a very special guest, the co-founder and the CTO of Dozee, Gaurav Parchani. Huge round of applause, please.
Yeah, I'm probably going to need the podium. Good evening, everyone. I feel very privileged to be among the stalwarts of critical care in the country. And my job here is to represent technology. Right? My job here is to be a technologist and engage in this conversation, engage in the conversation of a vision which is basically mission zero code blues. And who better to discuss it with who receives these code blues, who is on the receiving end of these when the patient actually deteriorates and is actually coming to ICU, but not really in time. You would have really wanted the patient to come in earlier, or in fact to look at the patient earlier where they are and not really come to ICU at all. And this is where I'm going to be opening up a little bit of technology and how technologists could help and technology can help in bridging this gap of resources that we have amongst the ICU and the non-ICU, in terms of the resources that we have, in terms of the monitoring solutions that we have. This is going to be an attempt to kind of initiate that conversation. But before we go there, and before we even look at redefining healthcare, right, we need to look at three very critical things if we really need to look at how patient safety could be improved beyond the ICU. We really need to look at how do we perceive this, right? How do we take monitoring outside the ICU? Is this even required? Are there patients that are critical that are outside the ICU? Can we catch them earlier? So we really need to change that attitude in terms of, yes, monitoring is required. Yes, we need novel solutions. Yes, we need innovative things to come in and experiment and see where we could get. We obviously would need continuous and reliable data, right? Without data, you cannot really take a decision, or without data, you cannot really take, even intuition is data. Talking to the patient, looking at how they're behaving, what their color of the skin is and whatever, is a lot of data points that somebody could capture and take decisions based intuition. And then finally comes early warning system. That's the last thing on the list because you have prerequisites on top of it. You need basically people wanting to participate in patient care outside the ICU, and you really need a lot of reliable data that you could build these early warning systems over. And one such solution, we've heard a little bit about Dozee, and this is something I'm going to be keeping brief, but I'm going to go deeper into the technology aspect of Dozee, right? We've leveraged ballistocardiography, which I'm going to cover in the next few slides. And as Professor Tebul mentioned, ballistocardiography, actually the fun fact about it is it actually precedes all of us. It was invented in the year 1877 when none of us were born. And it was actually invented to monitor or to first map the cardiac cycle. It was one of the first things that could do that. ECG came in close to 1903. So years after BCG was invented, ECG came about and said that this is the best method to monitor cardiac rhythm. BCG essentially translates to ballisto, meaning the force or the movement. Cardiac is obviously heart, graphy is measuring. So measuring the movement of the heart. It literally translates to that. And it was first put in weighing scales, much like the podium that I'm standing on. All the vibrations that my body is producing is going through ground, through that podium. So it was built for weighing scales, later tried on chairs, beds, N number. In fact, even NASA put it in the space suits of the astronauts once to actually capture the vibrations that their heart or lung motion or abdomen motion is actually producing. We've miniaturized it and put it under the mattress so that it could go in any bed that you have in the hospital. It is compatible with anything, not just hospital, actually it could go to home as well, and it is going to home. All the data is transmitted to the cloud and then is visible on the central station, a central monitoring station associated to that ward. And in fact, even at your fingertips as doctors, you could monitor your patients anywhere. In fact, some of you could monitor them here itself while you're sitting here, provided you have good network reception here, could monitor them while your patients are in the hospital or even at their home. And I would love to play a small video before I deep dive into the technology. This video demonstrates how vibrations are captured and then how these vibrations are transmitted to the cloud and how we could identify signs of deterioration in deteriorating patients. That's the fancy part of it, but coming to the reality here. Now, this is the sensor, this is the signal that you essentially get at the end of the day. Now, this is captured from underneath the mattress. Doesn't matter how thick your mattress is, the sensor auto-calibrates and adjusts to your condition, the patient, the mattress and everything. And it could capture a physiological signal which is representation of all the vibrations coming from your thoracic region. So be it your cardiac contractions, be it your lung movements, be it your pulmonary motion, in fact even body movements and muscle twitches and snoring events as well when the patient is sleeping. And that's how I've represented a very high amplitude, high frequency, the black color zone as body movements. Obviously the first thing that we do is we take it, we identify it, and then we throw it apart. That because the further signal in green is going to go into deeper analysis and where we get the spikes that you see, vertical spikes are, and we're going to go further in that with those vertical spikes, but those are your heartbeats, or those are actually your cardiac contractions or the LV blood flow that you essentially see. And a slow movement of the sinusoidal nature that you see is your pulmonary motion or is your respiratory effort. And if you essentially compare it to an ECG, because we keep experimenting a lot, we keep collecting a lot of these signals together, a plethysmogram, an ECG, a BCG, a lot of these signals we could collect together and we could analyze them together. And if you look on top, obviously is the ECG, all of you recognize that. And on bottom you have a zoomed in version of your ballistocardiography, BCG. And you could exactly see where the high amplitude motion that comes is your systolic region, followed by a very small blip that you see with a very flat period is your diastolic part there, over there. So here you could deep dive into understanding what is the effort or what is the impact of a cardiac motion or a full heart rhythm on a sensor that is placed underneath the mattress, placed on the person, could be placed anywhere, but it's essentially capturing vibrations that a body produces. Now, which is where if you essentially look at the previous ones with just my eyes or with anybody in the room, if I could tell them to count the number of peaks or count the number of spikes and then divide it with the time. Let's say I have 60 peaks in 1 minute, my heart rate is 60 BPM. It's obviously not a rocket science. And you could obviously see the motion that you see, the circular motion that you see, semicircles, those are obviously your respiratory efforts. So if I could ask somebody to count them, you would obviously give me out the respiratory rate as well, right? It's as simple as that. But this is where the fun comes, right? When you start analyzing this data, not just in the time domain that we saw, but beyond that as well. What about the energy impact in that particular wave? Or what about the frequency decomposition of that particular wave and particular wave? So now this is, like in your ECG you have PQRST, in BCG we have HIJKL, it's exactly similar. The IJK wave is the corresponding wave to QRS wave. So the QRS wave is the exact instruction for the polarization and depolarization, and this is where IJK is the actual output when the motion actually happened. So if you would actually go back in the previous few slides here, there's a slight delay between the big amplitude in the blue signal and in the red signal. That's primarily 30 to 40 milliseconds, which is what it takes for the heart to actually take the signal from the SA node and actually beat. And that's where you see the delay. But this is where you could analyze every single beat and look at the energy composition or spectrum composition of that beat. Now, obviously we don't want to do it beat by beat, but when you look at 40 hours of that data, now this is captured in an ICU patient, and then the white line that you see on top of it is not really from Dozee at all. It's actually from the systolic blood pressure from a radial ABP measurement, right? And the colors that you saw, the energy spectrums that you saw in the previous slide are zoomed up and added up in 40 hours. Now imagine thousands and thousands of those heartbeats are all aggregated upon. Now could you all see there's a pattern that the white line is following and then the colors are following. The way to read this graph essentially is 3 axis. The x-axis is time, the y-axis is frequency, and the z-axis, which is the color. The brighter the color, higher the energy in that frequency at that time, right? So if you look at the pink zones, which is where your higher energy is there and the blood pressure is high, as soon as the patient drops from 133 to 83, the font is pretty low, but the biggest drop that you see in the white line is basically going from 133 systolic blood pressure to 83, a 50 mm drop. You see a drastic change in the composition of colors as well, or energy spectrum, not just colors. Now, again, this is just one dimension. Look at the other dimension. If I pick up each and every heartbeat, look at the top left graph. If I pick up every heartbeat, lay them on top of each other, thousands and thousands of heartbeats on top of each other is what that looks like. The color coding is on the graph towards the right side, the second graph, the middle graph. 80 to 100 systolic blood pressure is represented by a dark purple color, and then 120 to 140 is represented by an orangish yellow color. Could you see a difference in beats on top of each other? Can you differentiate the purple beats with the orange and reddish beats? With the blood pressure changing, these beats become narrower and longer as the blood pressure goes high, shorter and broader as the blood pressure goes low. Now this is another dimension. Now imagine 24 such dimensions, because these are features. And these features on real-time basis, a machine calculates, puts them in a deep learning model, and then figures out what's the change in blood pressure that has happened, right? If I could go back to these graphs, if nothing, these colors could easily tell you the blood pressure has changed drastically. If not even the right value or the absolute value, they could easily tell you what the trend of the blood pressure looks like. And if I give a calibration value, initial calibration value, I could see these models detecting, okay, this much is the change, this is the initial calibration value at time t, so at t plus 1 hour, this is the value. And within every 10 minutes, t plus 70 minutes, t plus 80 minutes, t plus 90 minutes, and so forth, you could actually get successive readings with respect to change in blood pressure. Obviously, this requires a lot of validation. We're working with Professor Tebul on this to further validate this, to further develop this, but this is something that already is showing a lot of promise. But not just the vitals, right? We discussed about heart rate, respiratory rate, we discussed about blood pressure. We also have mechanisms to capture the pulse oxygen through your regular finger pulse oximeters. We would also have temperature sensors as well, right? But once you get all of this data, right, we really need to power an early warning system. We just discussed in the last talk by Dr. Rashid that alarm fatigue is a big problem. False alarms are a big problem, right? There was a study in the US that says that in the ICUs, on an average, a patient on an ICU monitor, a regular ICU monitor, gets 76 alarms per patient per day, right? That's more than 3 or 4 alarms per hour, right? What would you, and that's constant throughout for thousands and thousands of patients. So how would you essentially look at the effectiveness of these alarms if they always keep beeping and beeping and beeping again and again? So we've developed a smart mechanism in order to basically introduce a different tiering system to this. So you could say this alert is much higher in terms of criticality if the heart rate goes over 140, or a combination of these, and then designate this as a higher tier alert. And then you could designate something as a lower tier alert and then define your protocols accordingly. So alarm fatigue could essentially be solved by differentiating between these alerts, or whether it's a tier 2 alert or whether it's a tier 3 alert. And one of the biggest things that we've seen in the clinical studies that I'm going to talk about now is frequency of these alerts. How many alerts of such we've seen in patients for the past 24 hours or past 6 hours? They have a very clear prognostic value in terms of identifying that these patients are going to go home, these patients are going to go to the critical care units, and quite accurately so. Now, this is a graph that I'm sure a lot of you who are used to for your ICU patients. Right? If I ask you, it's a no-brainer to actually plot a minute-by-minute readings of your vitals, right? For heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, pulse oxygen, right? Saturation. What if I told you this is not from an ICU patient, this is from a outside the ICU patient who was actually declared code blue in one of our clinical studies that we were essentially looking at, and you get such type of minute-by-minute data and the trends along with it, along with the red lines marking the alerts that were given at that point of time with different tiers, right? Imagine such power having that outside the ICU without any intervention from a nurse or without any intervention to get that data out. The data comes out automatically. And for reference, I've marked the blue points that you essentially see are spot checks that would have been done 6 hours apart. They correlate really well, and in this case, for example, also capture a lot of trend information as well from the vitals. And if you look at the frequency of alerts, right? When the patient coded blue, there was actually 28 alerts in the last 24 hours. Now, I'm going to talk about how many of these alerts are there for normal patients as well, so that you have context, what 28 means and what essentially in time this would look like. But look at this patient, where if you look at the 2 mountain peaks that you see in heart rate, where the patient compensated and decompensated again and went through those cycles, those would have been completely missed by spot checks. Because with spot checks and intermittent monitoring, even if you could rely on them, you're leaving the patient on luck. Your nurse should go at the right time and take the right spot check without any information that something is going to happen. So in this case, if the spot checks would have been done in heart rate, the patient would have been fairly normal and stable because it's quite flat. But if you really zoom in and look at what happened between those spot checks, the heart rate actually went to 140 and came back. So 130 and came back, 135 or so and came back. And again in here, 26 alerts before a patient deteriorated and was declared code blue, moved to the ICU. Now, we tried to replicate this in King George Medical University as an observational study. So we did not take any interventions, but we just collected data. This was 715 or 706 patients, for close to 84,000 plus hours of data in 2 wards, 72 beds for almost 3 months or so. We could show that these alerts have a prognostic ability to identify 91% of patients that required escalations at least 8 hours in advance. Right? 8 hours are quite good enough for a critical care specialist such as yourself to identify and take interventions at the right time. Versus we simulated spot checks, and spot checks would have missed 33% of the patients even at the time of escalation. Right? So this is where the clear difference comes, and when we essentially only rely on spot checks, and then we miss a lot of data in the middle of it. And again, this is where this is just 2 patients right now, but we have multiple of these patients where 2 different journeys. One patient started at high risk outside the ICU, was managed very well, didn't require an ICU intervention, and the number of alerts went down, and then finally the patient was discharged. Was probably at 1 alert in the last 24 hours or so. The patient in red started at 0 alerts and remained there for a good period of time, for at least a few hours there, and then started deteriorating, and then at 14 alerts required an ICU transfer. So this patient journey is something that we've mapped for thousands of patients, and we could validate, and we could essentially correlate their outcomes with respect to the frequency of these monitoring. A lot of our systems of News, Muse, Apache, and all the other early warning systems ignore the most important part, which is the time component. Yes, the News score would have been 6, but for how long it has been 6. Or yes, the score is 9, but for how long it has been 9, or how long it has been increasing to 9. And this is where continuous monitoring brings you that dimension of time associated with it, that this is what the picture looks like right now, this is the picture looked like 24 hours ago, and this is all the story in the middle of it. We're repeating that study as well, so it's not just one center. So this is an ongoing study at CMC Vellore. We've already crossed the KGMU threshold. We're at 800. We're actually going to get to 4,000 here. And I'm super excited because this is not only the general ward, but we've seen medical oncology, BMT, hepatobiliary, neurology, neurosurgery, and pulmonary, 6 wards where we're looking at this and correlating these early warning signs with the patient outcomes there. The second phase of this study is going to be super interesting because we are also going to take intervention in the second phase, where we're going to ask a nurse or a doctor to basically go and evaluate basis an alert, what would they do. And this is where we'll have a proper prospective clinical data associated with it, published data that could show the effectiveness of these alerts, not just the promise by saying that this is an observational study, but also an interventional study along with it as well. We've already collected 100,000 hours of data. We've seen 3.8% escalations, which is very similar to KGMU. More importantly, in some of the specialties, we've seen 29% escalations, BMT, and obviously BMT patients are at higher risk. Again, this is where, now this is the most fun part for me, and this is the most important part for me, and this is where I feel this system is still evolving, and the system will keep evolving for the years to come. There's too much potential here to be done with it and start basically say that this has no more potential left, because this is just the beginning of all of it. Now, this is where if you looked at it, my previous slides on early warning system was still based on heuristics and statistics, right? Where's the real machine learning part of component on it? Yes, there's a lot of machine learning in finding the vibrations, identifying the noise, getting to the blood pressure information and all the other vital information. But in the early warning system of it, right, my biggest problem, as Dr. Rashid said, is very low specificity, right? Because these alarms keep beeping all the time. And how do we differentiate? So we've done amazing with heuristics. We've shown a 20x reduction in alarm if we didn't have our smart alerting system. So 20x. So if you're going to receive 200 alerts, you're only going to receive 10 alerts, right, for that particular patient. And that's a huge amount. But how do we really become specific in time and say that at T-4, this patient is definitely going to code blue with a 90% confidence, right? How do we increase that specificity? And this is where the real AI comes in. Now, as an engineer, I am in awe of all your day-to-day activities. I've seen ICU doctors. I have observed all of you guys in your natural settings, in ICU and critical care. And I'm in complete awe of how you consume all of this information with years and years and years of knowledge, and then basically take actions basis that. Now, this is where could we add more information in a very easy consumable manner so that we could make this clinical decision support system a little bit more specific. And how do we do that? So we need to move from heuristics to real AI powered. Now I have a I have a small sneak peek into this. This is nowhere ready. We really need to work together on this, and we really need to work hard on this to make this a reality. But this holds a lot of promise. And in my opinion, when we look at heart, respiration, blood oxygen, skin temperature, and all of these things, what we really miss out, because as humans, we could only consume so much information. So look what we did with Muse and News. We took a lot of data. We then took 5 vitals at a particular time. We combined them into one score because it's easy to consume one score and it's easy to make protocols on that. It's easy to teach nursing that, yes, if the score is this, let me know. Or if the score is this, do this sort of intervention or do this investigation on top of it. But a machine is really not limited. A machine sees the value, a machine sees the trend in time, and a machine sees the signal itself. So it could identify signal abnormalities as well. And we do a lot of work on arrhythmias, we do a lot of work on cardiac rhythm, but vibrations are one component where this is completely unexplored greenfield, where we really need to deep dive and make sure that we capture these changes in vibration and structural changes and then correlate them with patient deteriorating. We could get a lot more specific. How? Can you, all of you see beyond the blue line in the middle, left side and right side, there are 4 graphs and 4 graphs. Could all of you say that they are different categories or they're quite different and easily differentiable to a human eye? Obviously, on the left, there's a lot more yellow. On the right, there's a lot more purple. Now, on the left are patients that were discharged and they went home. And this is their data 1 hour ago. On the right, there are patients, 2 of them were fatalities in the ward, and 2 of them actually moved to the ICU, were in that state of being declared as a code blue. This plot is essentially a recurrence plot of respiratory patterns. Exactly what Dr. Ashit was talking about. Why respiratory patterns and respiratory activity is so important. Now, an AI could look into the dimension of recurrence and could look at periodicity. And as an engineer, this is so fascinating to me because you study in mechanical engineering that when a machine is dying or a oscillating machine is slowly decompensating, you observe very low frequency oscillations. And in this case, you see them in respiration. So these plots essentially represent the periodicity, more the purple color, more slow frequency periodicity. And giving them to an AI. Obviously, I'm not saying that this as graph should come to the doctor, but these parameters should go in combination to an ensemble model that essentially identifies that there is a risk in this particular thing, but not just a black box saying that there is a risk, but there is a risk because there are abnormal respiratory patterns. It gives you much more information to look into or where to look into. Imagine a screening solution not just telling you, okay, please look at this because this is the triage, but it's also telling you why it feels that it's the case. Another case, for example, this patient passed away in the ward, and this is 20 hours worth of data. This is the same spectrum that I showed you in the blood pressure graph, but if you essentially look at it, there is clear differentiation 3 hours earlier, 5 hours earlier to that, and then 12 hours earlier to that. Now, I am no expert in physiology. You will obviously understand it way better than I do, but as an engineer, I could look at that there are patterns that are quite different. A machine learning system could easily identify them. But this is exactly where we need to come together and explain the mathematics and the machine learning of it with combination with physiology, right? Because this is all physiological data that we are capturing from the patient. And this is where I would like to end the talk today before the stellar panel comes to the dais with a small request that we all, if we have to make sure that we redefine healthcare and going back to our mission of Mission Zero Code Blues, we all need to come together, acknowledge that obviously this technology is not perfect. There are lots and lots of scope. There are new things that could be added. The existing things could be made better. But this is exactly the room that we need. We need a group of technologists and we need a group of clinicians that work together hand in hand to make sure that we are applying these principles, and then essentially the next generation of early warning systems are actually coming out of our country, not really following global guidelines, but we setting and helping in setting up the global guidelines. So thank you for that, and I would love to carry on this conversation during dinner if anybody of you wants to brainstorm on this further. Thank you so much.
Gaurav, what a treat. It was an incredibly comprehensive overview, and what's so fascinating about many of Gaurav's comments, perhaps with him mentioning no technology is perfect, this particular technology, while being incredibly patient-centric, seems to do so through the lens of the medical professional. So huge round of applause for Gaurav and the entire Dozee team once again.